whiteboard, or any similar surface for writing on, is a really key tool for teachers to master in order to be effective as a teacher. A whiteboard allows us to give students supplementary visual information for what we're saying. So in this session, we're going to take a quick look at some of the key things to keep in mind when you're using your whiteboard as you teach language. We'll start by briefly discussing the role of the whiteboard as a teaching tool in the language classroom. Then we'll take a look at how to organize your whiteboard. And finally, we'll look at different tips to keep in mind as you're teaching and using your whiteboard. The whiteboard is a really important tool for us as teachers for two main reasons. First of all, the whiteboard allows us to provide students with the visual side of the language. As we speak and interact with our students, we're providing students with the verbal piece of the language, or the verbal side of the language. The whiteboard, or any similar writing surface, allows us to provide the visual side of the language. So students hear the language, and then when we put something on our whiteboard or similar surface, they get the visual side of the language. They need both sides of the language to thoroughly learn that language, whether it's English or any other language. The whiteboard also allows us to better support different student learning styles. If you recall, there are 3 sensory preference learning styles that students may have. One is visual, one is auditory, and one is kinesthetic. So the whiteboard allows us to support students who have a visual learning style. So these are students that like to see what they're learning. We're automatically supporting students with an auditory learning style as we speak and deliver the lesson. So the whiteboard allows us to hit the visual styles as well. Interestingly, a whiteboard also allows us to support students with a kinesthetic learning style, because we can get those students up here at the whiteboard and actively digesting or processing the language as they write on the whiteboard. So the whiteboard, or a similar surface, is really good for supporting those different student learning styles. There's another real strength to the whiteboard or a similar writing surface, and that is it allows us to fluidly represent what's going on in the lesson in a visual manner. You may like to use PowerPoint as you teach your lessons, and PowerPoint definitely has some strengths to it. But the strength of the whiteboard is that it allows us to elicit information from the class and then get that information up here on the whiteboard. So it really allows us to visually capture the fluidity of the lesson, and we get to capture student answers here on the whiteboard. With a PowerPoint, on the other hand, we don't manage to capture student answers because we've already prepared the PowerPoint beforehand. So this is another strength of the whiteboard as a teaching tool. It allows us to capture student answers visually as the class progresses. Another really important use of the whiteboard is it allows us to highlight the key points that we're trying to make throughout our lesson. And as we highlight those key points, we can focus student attention on those key points, and they can then better remember what we're trying to teach. So one of the uses of a whiteboard is to really highlight or get the key information up here, and students can pay attention to it and focus on it. And walking out the door at the end of the class, students know that whatever went up here on the whiteboard is what they should have learned and what they need to remember and retain. So that's another key important use of the whiteboard, is to focus students on those key points of your lesson. The starting point with using your whiteboard as a teaching tool is to have in your head a really clear picture or organizational structure for how you're going to use all of this space that you've got. If you just use your space randomly, so you decide, okay, I'm going to put something here, and then I'm going to put something down here and something up here, it gets really confusing for students, and you actually start to negate the usefulness of the whiteboard as a teaching tool. So have a clear picture in your head in terms of how you're going to organize what actually goes up here. So I'm going to walk you through how I organize a whiteboard. You might choose to do it a little bit differently, but this gives you an idea of what I mean when I say organize your whiteboard. So with a whiteboard, I kind of designate it into the 4 corners, here, 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 and here, and then this big middle space is my working space. My whiteboard is quite a bit smaller than the one you're probably going to be working with, but I can at least show you how to kind of block the different pieces of the whiteboard off. So I start with my objectives for the lesson, and they go up here in this corner. So I'm going to write objectives up at the top of my whiteboard, and then I'm going to list my objectives for the lesson. And then as my lesson progresses, I'm actually going to check off the objectives that we've covered. So when we cover objective number 1, I check that off. When we cover objective number 2, I check that off. And when we covered objective number 3, I check that off. Then I designate the space down here as my homework space. So this is where I indicate what homework students have to complete, and then the next day or the next class when students come in, we work through that homework and we check that off as well. So this is my homework space down here, and I list my homework items, and then once we mark them or correct them the next day, I check those off as well. Then we've got this space over here, and up here, I designate this as my vocabulary space. So as we're working through the lesson and any new vocabulary items come up, I write those words down on the vocabulary section of the whiteboard. I don't put the meanings down, I just put the words there so that students can remember, okay, these are the words we learned in this lesson, and these are the words that I need to remember. So as new vocabulary items come up, I write them in the vocabulary section. Then I also designate another section of my whiteboard down here as my grammar section. And this is where I write any key grammatical structures that we learn or that students have questions about. And as they come up in the lesson, I write them down here so students once again remember, hey, these are the key things from this lesson that I need to remember. So my grammar goes down there. And then the space behind me, if I had a bigger whiteboard, this would be a bigger space, obviously. But this is my working space. So as we're working through questions, or we're taking up answers to things, or I'm teaching a grammar point, all of my working visual information goes here. And I might erase this 3, 4, 5, or 6 times during a lesson. So these other spaces tend to stay up throughout the lesson, but this working space, this is where I do all of the ongoing work as the lesson progresses. So this is just one way that you can organize your whiteboard space so that students know where to find everything that you're presenting visually to them throughout the lesson. When you're using the working space of your whiteboard, so if you recall, I said that I kind of keep the middle part of my whiteboard as my working space. When you're using this, also think about how you're going to organize that working space. And one really good tip to keep in mind is to think about, can you put things into columns and rows whenever possible? So here's an example. If I'm teaching my students simple present for everyday actions or routines or something like that, I'm going to write my columns along the top and then my example sentences in rows underneath those columns. So it looks like this. So when I'm making a simple present sentence, I'm going to have a subject. So I have my subject here, and then I'm going to have my verb in the simple present. And because I'm talking about everyday actions, I'm going to have my time marker or my frequency marker. Okay? So I'll call that my frequency marker. Okay, and then underneath this, I'm going to put my example sentences. She, that's my subject, swims, that's my verb in simple present. Notice the S for my third person. And then every day is my frequency marker. And I might put another example. He runs, and once again we need our S because it's third person singular, once a month. So whenever you're using your working space, try and keep that as organized as possible as well. Use columns and rows and things like that. I'm going to take you through some tips to keep in mind as you're using your whiteboard as a teaching tool. These tips also work for any similar surface that you're writing on as your lesson progresses, like a blackboard or a smartboard. So the first tip to keep in mind is to print, not write. I'm going to show you the difference between writing versus printing so that you can see that the printing is actually the much better option because students can read this more easily. So here's the same sentence. I'm just teaching simple present, for example, and I want to write an example sentence, here's that sentence in writing versus printing, and you can see the clarity difference. So if I'm writing it, I get, she swims every day. That's my writing versus my printing. She swims every day. So the printing should hopefully be better to read or easier to read. And writing when we're going along tends to also go up on an angle more easily than the printing does. So the printing is definitely the better way to go. Also, don't do a mixture of printing and writing either. Make sure you keep it all printing. So no writing when you're doing the whiteboard, use printing. The second tip is to make sure that your printing on the whiteboard is large enough for students sitting at the very, very back of your room to see. There's no point in putting information up on the whiteboard if it's so tiny that students actually can't read it. So in order to check whether your printing is large enough, print in your usual print size on the whiteboard and then go to the back of the classroom and make sure you can actually read it. So just to give you an idea of the difference, here's the same sentence, she swims every day, in larger print versus smaller print, and obviously the larger print is easier to read. So she swims every day. That's a fairly good size to be seen from the back of the classroom, whereas this one is a little bit too small for students right at the back to see. So make sure that your print size is big enough for students to see from the back of your classroom. This next tip is one that I always have trouble following, and that is don't turn your back on the class as you're writing on the whiteboard. I always make a joke and say, oh, you're having a great conversation with the whiteboard while you're teaching. So what you don't want to do is this. So you don't want to turn your back on the class and then have a great conversation with your whiteboard as you're writing, okay? That's not very good. So your students don't want to see the back of your head and your back. What you have to do, and this is something you constantly have to remind yourself to do, is find a way to write and kind of open yourself up so that you can see the class as you write. So you want to do something like this. So she swims every day. Okay, so you want to get yourself to the side somehow as you're writing. And sometimes you'll sort of turn into the board, but don't fully turn into the board like that. So make sure you don't have a conversation with your whiteboard as you're writing on the board. The third tip is just for people who are left-handed. Unfortunately, writing left-handed on the whiteboard is even more of a challenge than writing right-handed on the whiteboard is, because it's far more difficult to not have a conversation with your whiteboard if you're writing with your left hand. So I'll show you what this looks like, and I'll show you what you have to be really careful of if you are a lefty. I am not naturally a lefty, so no comments about the quality of my writing here, but I'll demonstrate the challenge that comes with being a lefty and using the whiteboard. So when you're left-handed, you have to reach across and you automatically kind of turn your back on the class and you automatically have that conversation with the whiteboard. So you have to be extra conscious of, one of your choices is to reach out across like this and then turn your neck or turn your head. So you're going to do something, whoa, my left-handed writing is not very good. Okay, so let me try that again. So you're going to reach right across like this and keep checking in with your class as you write. So she swims every day. That's pretty bad left-handed writing. Okay. The other option is to take it from the other side actually, and you're going to go this way as you write. So here's what that looks like. So you're going to write this way so that you're more, this is really bad left-handed writing, so that you're more naturally turned towards your class. The problem with this one is your arm tends to hide a little bit what you're writing, but it does allow you to make sure that you face the class more often than you do if you're writing this way. So if you're a left-hander, I'll let you play around with that, but just always keep in mind, with lefties, it's much easier to, unfortunately, turn your back to the class and have that conversation with the whiteboard, so make sure you don't do that. Another thing to keep in mind as you're using your whiteboard or a similar writing surface is to use different colored markers, if possible, in order to further illustrate the key points you're making or the grammar structures or words that you're teaching. So as an example, if I'm teaching simple present as a habitual action or routine, using my sentence, she swims every day, I could use different colored markers to show different parts of my sentence. So for example, I'm going to use black for my subject, okay. And then I'm going to put my verb in orange. Okay, and then I'm going to put my frequency marker in blue. So she swims every day. And then if I put another example under there, I'm going to follow the same color code, okay? So I'm going to put that's my subject, that's in black. Okay? And I'm going to use yellow. Or sorry, I'm colorblind here, that's orange. Okay. And then I'm going to use, oh, you know what? I'm going to change that verb a bit. Hang on a second. I'm not going to do play. I'm going to do run, because that makes my sentence easier. So my verb is run, so I'm going to put that in orange. And then my frequency is once a week, and that goes in blue. So use your colors, if you've got them, very strategically to illustrate or to diagram the different components of what it is you're teaching. In this case, I'm teaching different parts of a simple present sentence, and I've got 3 different colors that I'm using. If you don't have different colors, you can still illustrate things visually, but instead of using different colors, you're going to use different symbols or underlining systems. So going back to our sentence, she swims every day, I don't have any different colors, I just have black. So I'm going to use a different symbol code in order to show the different pieces of my sentence. So my subject, I'm going to put in black, and I'm going to leave it plain. Okay? And then my verb, I'm going to underline. Okay? And then every day, I'm going to put a squiggly line underneath it. The other thing I can do with my whiteboard is I can use diagrams. So if I want to somehow show the relationship, here between my subject and then my word ending, I can use circles and arrows and diagrams to really visually represent the relationship that I'm trying to demonstrate with my sentence analysis. So if you don't have different colors, use different diagrams and underlining systems to make your points as you're analyzing the structures or the vocabulary that you're teaching. And another tip, and unfortunately I'm guilty of this, and you'll probably see it on the video, try not to have your writing either make an upward angle or a downward angle. So try and keep your writing parallel to the lines of the whiteboard. You don't want your students kind of having to do this in order to read what you write. So don't do this. Where my writing is clearly going on an angle. Try and keep it parallel and straight. I'm guilty of this one. It's not quite as easy to write straight as you might think, but this is another thing to keep in mind. A couple of final tips for using your whiteboard. Some whiteboard surfaces and blackboard surfaces are magnetic. So if this is the case with the surface that you're using, take advantage of it. I don't have any on me, but you can purchase little tiny magnets and you can stick things up on your surface using the magnets. So for example, you can put flashcards up and then put a magnet on top. You can put pictures or diagrams up and just put it up there for the whole class to see. So if your writing surface is magnetic, make use of it. The next tip may sound a little bit obvious, but you'd be surprised how many teachers unfortunately get caught in this situation. Make sure your whiteboard is clean. Unfortunately, an unclean whiteboard simply means that the colors that you're writing on there don't jump out and students actually can't see them. So make sure that your whiteboard is clean. If you don't have a cleaning staff in your program, make sure you've got yourself things to keep your whiteboard clean. There's sprays that you can use, obviously a whiteboard eraser and so on. So make sure your board is clean at the start of every class. The last tip is another fairly obvious one, but every teacher gets caught in this situation as well. Make sure your whiteboard markers work. Unfortunately, once the markers start to run out, and they run out fairly quickly, it's very difficult to see what you're writing from the back of the classroom. It just starts to fade more and more and more as you use up the marker. So always make sure that your markers work. Check them either at the end of every class or the beginning of every class. And if they're running out, get rid of them and get some new ones. We've gone through the reason why the whiteboard is a really useful teaching tool, or the whiteboard or any similar surface. We've gone through what to put on your whiteboard and how to organize your whiteboard, and then finally some tips to keep in mind as you're using your whiteboard. I'm going to leave you with one final tip. Using a whiteboard effectively is not something that comes naturally to anyone. It's something that you have to practice. So it may sound ridiculous, but before a lesson, come in a bit early, get up there at your whiteboard, and practice writing the different things that you're going to use your whiteboard for. Practice, practice, practice so that your writing is much easier. Make sure it's clear and easy to read, and just make sure you're comfortable using this as a teaching tool. It does not come naturally. You've got to practice it.